Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola and our local area's love affair with the automobile. In our first episode, we talked about how the automobile itself came into being with people like Benz and Olds and Ford and a host of others literally transforming the old buggy into a gasoline engine propelled vehicle. And all sorts of things happened in those first years, but Pensacola and Escambia County, of course, were sort of out of that picture until 1910. And as we told you in our first episode, we had the first dealership here in exactly 1910. And by the time we got into the middle of the next decade, we were beginning to add all of the other niceties that you needed, places where where a driver could go to get fuel and to get service in many different ways. And by the time we got to the end of the 1920s, Pensacola was becoming an automotive center. I'm going to just give you a few of the names that were present because, well, a lot of them, of course, were stayed around for a long time. But if you excuse me for just reading this just a little bit, but I didn't want to miss out on some of them. We had the Scarrett Motor Company, which sold Packard automobiles. Brock and Yates were the dealers for the Dodge. Malden Ford was in existence by then, as was the Pensacola Buggy Works. Girdleston Motors sold the Oakland. Sun Buick Company, of course, was the Buick dealer. Lee Motors sold the Studebaker. Abbott had the Hupmobile and the Franklin, and Brockett Motors the Hudson and the Terraplane, and there were others too. Of course, as we got into the late 1920s and early 1930s, we don't want to misunderstand how a dealer worked. Because a dealership of that time, almost all of these operated out of what had been little storefront businesses along the main streets downtown. They had a little shop in the back and would have one or two, maybe even three vehicles that they could show, but there was nothing like the broad inventory of cars and trucks that a dealer of the 21st century would have. Instead, much of the ordering was done after someone had had a test ride, had looked at all of the notebooks and charts and so forth that the dealer would have, so that the purchaser would get an idea of what he could get in the way of extras, what the upholstery was going to be like. And then, of course, the automobile was ordered from Detroit. It would be shipped here on a freight car, and then, of course, went into service. Now, when we get into the 1920s and 30s, it's a little bit kind of interesting for us in our new century to look back and see some of the things that motoring involved. Now, if you had been a child in the late 1920s and 30s, one of the things you would have gotten in your school was that one of your first readers, which was a wonderful little story that told how father went out to the garage and got the car ready every time the family wanted to take a trip. It talked about how he had to check the oil and the gasoline and the battery and the tires and all the things that father did. And that, of course, was pretty much standard procedure for that time. But we need to look a little bit at what cars began to look like. Now, I put a few models here in front of me today. These were typical of the commercial service vehicles that went into production beginning about 1907 or 8. This little van here would have been similar to this car, similar to this, would have been used by a great number of different companies, including the milk companies, the dairies, and of course even the post office. And this dump truck here, which of course was most of which were made by the Mack Truck Company, were in service, used by contractors and road builders and so forth. And this type model was in service well up into the 1930s. So these things did not change a whole lot, but the automobile itself did. Now, the earlier cars, the ones that were produced between 1900 and 1912 or 13, were largely what we would today call a soft top. They weren't convertibles exactly, but we did not have the steel top, turret top protection that we have, of course, in our vehicles today. That began to change in the late 1910s and into the 1920s when the automobile it took on a new look. It didn't look like a buggy anymore. It had much more of a square design, and of course all of the things that were added step by step were what we would today call a matter of convenience. Now, every automobile of that period was, of course, was much higher in its construction than the vehicles that we know today. Now, therefore, to get into the car, every vehicle had on both sides what they called a running board, and that was the place where one put his foot or maybe both feet as a support to get into either the front or the back seat. Now, no car of that period had what we today call a trunk. So what people did when they were going to go on, let's say, on vacation, and they were going to take their suitcases with them, they had two options. Number one was what they called a luggage carrier. This was a sort of an expandable metal sliding device, which with clips clipped onto the running board on the driver's side, and the suitcases would be stood on end between that sliding device and the door. And then, if you were going a long distance, you were a little fearful about the weather, you probably would have owned a tarpaulin that you could put over the top, and all of this then was secured with ropes. So this was one option. The other option, of course, and this was a little bit treacherous since many of the cars were still not completely covered with a steel top, was to put the suitcases and so forth on the top of the car and tie them on. Now, the back of the car, where one would think you were going to have your suitcases or your trunk, that was reserved for the spare tire. The earlier cars that had spare tires literally bolted them on the rear of the car. And when you moved into the early part of the 1930s and the more elegant design cars came along, they came to use what we called side mounts. These were very fancy affairs, sometimes with chrome, that were put on perhaps on both sides of the car to carry the extra tire. So that was an important part of what the design was all about. Now, as we move through this period, we see a lot of changes beginning to come into automobiles and trucks that were the result of automobile racing. The Indianapolis 500 was looked upon by some as just a sporting event, but believe me, beginning in the early part of the 19-teens, those races were the testing ground for all manner of different equipment and design items, and of course, particularly for tires. Now today, in the 21st century, we expect to get 25, 30, 40,000 miles out of a set of tires. Back in the period that we're addressing right now, the tires basically were warranted by people like Firestone and Goodyear and Goodrich and so forth, and Montgomery Ward. They were warranted for about 5,000 miles. So basically, every automobile owner and driver had to learn how to change a tire. He had to learn how to use a jack, to get down on his hands and knees, to jack the car up, to take the wheel off, to take the wheel off of the car, take the inner tube out, then find a way to locate the puncture, clean it with an abrasive piece of cloth, put a patch on it, then pump, using his automobile pump, he literally pumped air back in the tire, and then put it back on the wheel. It was not an easy thing, but when one went on a trip of any length, he could pretty well expect that he was going to have at least one puncture along the way, and maybe more. And that was just the way things went. Now, the comfort of the women in the car at that time was very important to the driver. Most of the time, the women sat in the rear, and of course, until we get well into the 1930s, there was no such thing as a heater in a car, certainly not air conditioning. So in the rear of the car, the manufacturer always installed across the back seat a long rope. It was very fancily coated in many cases. And that rope was there so that the driver or his lady could hang a robe over the top of that. And on colder days, the lady would simply bring that back and cover herself or others along with her in the rear seat of the car. So that was comfort. And of course, the idea of a radio in an automobile, that did not come on stream until the mid-1930s. And at that time, of course, they came. Radios were fine to have, but these were made back in the days when the tube type of equipment was in vogue. And the bouncing and jouncing of a radio inside an automobile made regular maintenance on that set very necessary. But it was there, and of course, young people in particular just absolutely love this. Now, by the time we get into the mid-19-teens and then into the 20s, we begin to see not only more commercial vehicles, But by now, we are also adding something that was very important to the American family, because now we began to have interstate transit buses. The Trailways and the Greyhound bus companies began to put routes clear across the country as far as they could with existing roads. We had such franchises here in Pensacola. Both of them were downtown, and for many years that is where the franchises were, and of course the franchises continue with us even today. But this was a very important part of life at that time, because there were many places in the country that even into the 20s and 30s, there was no railroad connection, and of course travel by air was just in its infancy then. So the automobile and part of what we had was just started. Now, another thing that every automobile owner feared, at least in the earliest part, was getting the car started. Now, initially, there was no such thing as a self-starter where one pressed a pedal or a button or turned a key. No, the driver had to get out, and often he had to have help in setting the spark inside, and he had to use a crank on the front of the car to turn over the engine and get it to fire. Now, the crank was of course, the only way to go, and of course, there were many cases across in our history of the automobile where people suffered broken arms because the crank flew back, struck the arm, and broke it. And this was something that, well, of course, you didn't look forward to at all. But by the time we get into the early 1930s, they have developed what I guess people sometimes called it a self-starter. And the earliest cars had a pedal right alongside either the brake or the accelerator, and the driver set the ignition and pressed that pedal, and that turned over the engine and started it. By the time we get into the late 1930s and early 40s, it is possible now to turn a key to start the ignition. Of course, that made a great difference. Also, in the cars of the 20s and 30s, you had, of course, this is long before the automatic transmission is part of it. There was a gear shift that was usually stood right beside the driver, right at his right knee. And right next to that was what the manufacturer called the emergency brake. Most cars, well, it was a little dangerous just to leave the car parked anywhere. So the emergency brake was pulled with the right hand, set in place so that when the car was not operating, was stationary, the emergency brake held it in place safely. So you had those two things together, and they sort of separated the driver and from his passenger on the right side. Now, along with all of this, you had all sorts of other things that you had to look at. Today we think about air conditioning and the comfort of a car, but things of the 20s and 30s were quite different. If you were going on a long journey or even a short one on a warm day, things were a little bit uncomfortable. So by the time you get into the early 1930s, some manufacturers began to make the windshield a device which literally would fold down. You had to turn a couple of clips on one on the other side, and you could literally fold the windshield down at least halfway, and the air would flow in. That was a step in the right direction. Another company, General Motors in particular, put what they called an airflow in there, and that was a device that literally was underneath the dashboard, and you pulled a lever, and that opened a little trap door so that air would come off of the engine hood and into the front seat of the car, and that worked and was present for a while. Another, of course, thing that we take for granted today is the windshield wiper. Now, in the earliest cars that finally were equipped with a wiper, and this comes about 1910, the wiper, it had no motor, so that basically the driver who was driving along steering with one hand would have to move the wiper back and forth manually, and it worked, but not very well. But finally they developed the idea of a motor tied in with compression, the engine compression, and while the engine was running, this would work, and most automobiles that got the windshield wiper got just one, at least at first. That was on the driver's side, of course, and it would be well into the 1930s before most automobiles had wipers on both sides. Now, the idea of who helps you with a car was so important in that period. Back in the 20s and 30s, there was a wonderful comic strip in most daily papers called Gasoline Alley, which illustrated how up and down the streets, people would literally help one another with the problems that they had in trying to keep their vehicles going. It was fun. It was part of the culture of the time because the automobile was becoming so much a part of our lifestyle here. And by the time we get to 1930, when the Depression began, Pensacola itself had more than 11,000 automobiles.